Welcome to another episode of the Confessions of a Recovering Landlord podcast, where you'll learn the secrets commercial landlords would prefer you not know. I'm your host, Jan Gibbons, along with my co-host and experienced commercial real estate broker, Bob Gibbons.
That's me.
Brought to you by Riata Commercial Realty, where we exclusively represent users of office and warehouse properties. Landlords have representation. Do you? On today's podcast, we're going to talk about playing Jenga.
I like Jenga.
I love Jenga. It was so fun.
Let's pause this. Let's pause this and go play.
Oh, it's too close to Christmas to ever be teasing about. Let's just go play. I am so ready.
It's kind of like when you were a spring semester senior in high school. You could not
I can't remember back that far.
Yeah, I know. That's back when the dinosaurs roamed for me.
Well, today we're relating that childhood favorite game to
office buildings.
Large office buildings and what the landlords want and what the tenants want.
What do the landlords want?
Stability. I know it. I know it, teacher.
And what do the tenants want?
Flexibility.
Ah, and those are compatible how?
Just like the game Jenga and my fingers.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, I mean, you're right. And this is, by the way, based on chapter 6 or confession 6 of the book, Confessions of a Recovering Landlord, which was published a year ago this month.
Oh my gosh.
Can you believe that?
And if any of our lovely listeners will email me, I will mail them out a copy of this chapter for free.
Ah, good idea. I hadn't even thought about offering that.
Maybe I should have given that to the end. Now they just won't listen to the podcast and just email me.
I don't know. Listening to us for 20 minutes versus reading the entire chapter. I think it's a pretty easy sell.
Toss up.
Well, so the whole point of this chapter of the book is that Jenga is the game played with the wood blocks where you stack them all up and then, each player pulls one out and stacks it on the top and, it gets more and more unstable and you wait for whoever is going to crash it down to, that's the person that loses. But yeah, it's a fun one. I've seen those at some like adult watering holes where they're like adult size, big ones. Those look kind of fun, although I've never played with one that size.
What is an adult watering hole? Just for our viewing audience.
I'll leave that to an imagination.
Okay.
Well, so in that chapter of the book, I compared playing Jenga with office buildings. And so I make the point that landlords want stability, as you mentioned. So they want a very stable, predictable cash flow for their building for, years into the future. But the tenants want flexibility. And so how does the landlord lease a building or what we call stack a building and still have really strong, stable income? Well, number one, they want to have good credit tenants. They want to have tenants that have very few options. And, why? Well, because every time a landlord gives a tenant an option within their lease, it makes that predictability of the cash flow a little less stable.
Okay, give an example. Give an example of an option that destabilizes the building.
Well, the biggie, the biggest one is a termination option. Mm-hmm. So the landlord has let's say a 7-year lease, but the tenant has the option to terminate the lease after 4 or 5 years. That's a pretty giant interruption of predictable cash flow. So that's the most obvious one, but there are a lot of other options that are much more commonly given to tenants. And for example, a renewal option. Mm-hmm. So you could argue, all right, the renewal option is actually good for the landlord because that means that the tenant has the ability to stay longer. But it's not the landlord's option, it's the tenant's option. And so, it's not a bad option for a landlord necessarily, but it's not one that they control directly. They have no control of whether or not it gets exercised. Now, the terms, the mechanism on how it gets, that
full rental rate with no TIs. I mean, they try to, if one is extended, they try to stack it appropriately.
Yeah, they try to slant it in their favor for sure. But that's another example. But then there's other things like an expansion option. There's a lot of different kinds of expansion options. And for example, you can have just a simple straight expansion option, which basically says, hey, landlord, I'm leasing this 50,000 square feet and I want an option on the 20,000 square feet next door. You have to, and I want that 2 years from today, which means the landlord can't they can lease it to someone else in the next 2 years, but at the end of the 2 years, it's got to be vacant, and ready to go for this tenant. That's a big, you know, problem for the landlord. Or it could be a right of first refusal, where all right, another tenant comes along and says, "I want the space," and they have to offer it to the tenant first. Or a right of first opportunity, which is the most common one because it gives more control to the landlord. Is, hey, the first time that space becomes available, we will give you the first opportunity to negotiate to expand into it, but you're not matching the terms of some other deal. And it's not on a set date necessarily. It's just whenever it first becomes available. It could be occupied space or not occupied space. So those are examples of ways that a tenant can ask for the opportunity to expand at some point in the future. And again, you're taking one of those blocks off the predictable cash flow and you're sticking it up on top because let's say that the tenant, well, let's say it's not a matching terms right of first refusal. Instead, it's a right of first refusal, but instead of matching the terms of that new tenant that wants to lease the space, it's on the same terms as the original lease with the tenant that's already in the building. Well, if the tenant in the building is at a $25 rental rate and the rental rate in the building is now 30, well, that means the landlord's not going to be able to capture that extra $5 a foot. Therefore, it's going to make, while it may be a stable income, it's not as high an income. And therefore, it's below market, which makes the building less valuable. So that's one of the, that's kind of the biggest thing. Now, landlords face all kinds of risk. They have what we'll call financing risk. They have to be able to raise the equity to buy the building, the debt to buy the building and finance it. So they have that kind of risk. They have economic risk, which is changes in the economy, like interest rates that we've seen recently. Then they have tenant failure risk. What happens if a tenant goes into bankruptcy and they can reject the lease, or they just quit paying rent and go out of business altogether? That's another risk. And then they have the risk of sublease competition. So now in this market right now, we have huge vacancy to start with, and then add on to that more sublease space. And now they're having to compete with their own tenants to get new tenants in the building. So they're facing a lot of risk, and they want to mitigate those risks in the lease negotiations. So all these things we're talking about, all these kinds of options, et cetera, landlords are always trying to mitigate the risk. And they want to avoid all these things if they can help it, but sometimes they can't. Like I mentioned a high credit tenant. They want a high credit tenant, right? Big high credit tenant. But guess what? That means that tenant has the power. So we did a deal a few years ago where it was a big international company that had great credit, and the rental rate that we had, or not just the rental rate, but the overall economic deal to the tenant ended up being 30% less than the initial offer from the landlord by the time the deal was done. And on top of that, the tenant got an option to terminate the lease after, I think it was 3 years, the right to expand, a right to renew, a right of first refusal.
A right to grow more hair on their bald men employees. I mean, you really negotiated the heck out of that thing. I thought you got a great deal for them.
Well, but that brings us to the point that this is not for everybody. Almost every tenant can get a renewal option, probably, because that's kind of almost a throwaway that landlords give you. But I have had deals where the landlord would not give a tenant a renewal option. But most of the time we get that. All these other things. I mean, another type of termination option is the death and disability clause. So if you have a company that's really, it'll make or break the company based on whether or not one individual is still working in the company and, making sales, let's say. So it could be a CPA, an attorney, a lot of professions, a doctor. So in those situations, you might want to have a death or disability clause. So if that landlord I'm sorry, if that tenant, that individual gets hit by a bus and dies or is permanently disabled and can't operate the business.
Give a real life example. You negotiated it for one of our clients and he promptly went out and killed himself on a motorcycle.
That is true. We actually, it was weird. We had 2 tenants within a 2-week period that both got into motorcycle accidents. One walked away, albeit hobbling, and the other one died. And yeah, so that's a situation. And he was an attorney.
He was an attorney, yeah.
And so yeah, that was one of those where it gave the estate, the heirs, the option to terminate the lease. It's not an automatic termination, but it's an option to terminate the lease, because if there's any value in the business that they sell, and that business that, whoever buys the business wants to keep the space, then all right, you have that ability, but it's an option to terminate.
Yeah.
So when we talk about all this kind of stuff, I would say the most important thing is timing, which basically means that when do you ask for all these things?
Before this hand has signed the lease.
Exactly. Or the other hand, either one.
No, I'm right-handed.
Or your keyboard on electronic signatures these days.
Love me some e-cigs.
Oh, that's the best. Yeah. So, you got to negotiate all this stuff at the time that you're doing the deal. If you don't do it when you do the deal initially, when the landlord is still begging to have you as a tenant, you're not getting this stuff. There is no incentive for a landlord to give any of this stuff to a tenant after the lease is signed, unless they get something else in return. So you have 2 years left on the lease. You're going to go extend the lease early and expand. All right, now the landlord's getting something they want. Now you have a shot at some of this stuff. But it's amazing that landlords tenaciously hold on to anything in the lease that's in their favor. So if you come up for a renewal or expansion, they don't want to give up anything. If you have a personal guarantee, they fight tooth and nail to avoid giving that up. Whereas we on the tenant side, we do the same thing. If there's anything in the lease we don't like, we negotiate to try and get rid of it and get more stuff. But like you said at the beginning, it's all about flexibility for the tenant and stability for the landlord.
Wait, you're giving away my key points at the end of the podcast.
We're not done.
We're getting there.
You want to just wrap it up?
I have 4 takeaways at the end. You just killed 2 of them. So yes, I think we're about done.
Those weren't even the best 2. So go ahead.
Well, number 1, like we said, tenants want flexibility. Number 2, landlords want stability. Number 3, what you just said, tenants should negotiate for everything they want before the lease is signed. There ain't no negotiating after you put your John Henry on there.
Without a doubt.
And I'm going to let you do number 4.
Well, that means I got to put my glasses back on.
You should remember this by heart.
Oh, with that setup, I don't even think I want to mention it. Size matters. Ladies, size matters.
We're talking about tenants. That's all we're talking about.
Yeah.
I don't know what you were inferring or implying.
You can only get this stuff if you're big enough to demand it. If the landlord wants you badly enough. Even a smaller tenant, sometimes it's not just that they're a small tenant, it's relative to the size of the building. A big tenant could be 5,000 square feet in a 10,000 foot building, and it's nothing in a 500,000 square foot building.
Right.
So that's why size matters. So it's relative size matters is probably the better way to say it.
Okay. I knew you would couch that.
Keep that
Thank
in
you
mind.
for listening to another episode of the Confessions of a Recovering Landlord.
Bye-bye.
We hope 2023 has been good to you.
Oh, this is our last one of the year.
This will be our last one of the year.
Oh.
And it may not get posted till New Year's. I don't know. So.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. And just a reminder to send in questions to see if we can stump Bob.
Not going to happen.
We really appreciate your taking the time to tune into this episode. We would love it if you would give us a 5-star rating on whatever platform you're listening to this on. And if you are on our YouTube channel, we would love to read your feedback in the comment section. Also, Be sure to subscribe so you get notified when we publish new episodes. Thanks, and see you next time.
Bye.